Is Japan's government set to shrink in size? Recently, Japan voted in Sei Takeichi, the latest Prime Minister and first ever female Prime Minister, sort of a conservative firebrand. She came into power with the help of the Ishin Party, who joined the government and became her new coalition partner. Now, they didn't do this freely. Ishin joined the government, but they did so with a list of 12 demands. Now, in my opinion, and based on what I've seen in the media, sort of towards the very top, if not the top of the list, appears to be a request to cut the size of Japan's government of around 465 representatives in the lower house by around 10%. So 46 or so Diet members who are currently elected will have to ultimately go come the next election, however this reform works, once there's a new set of elections and redrawing of boundaries in Japan. Now, this seems to be a crucial issue for Ishin. In fact, the leader of Ishin recently said that sort of trust between the LDP and Ishin would collapse if this bill wasn't submitted within the current session within Japan's Diet. So they're placing it as a very top priority based on that. And it's really dependent, the cooperation between the LDP and Ishin, on putting this through. Now, there's some anticipation that this might actually be difficult to get this passed. In fact, the Secretary General of the LDP has said it might be difficult to get agreement among all parties. And there's generally seems to be an anticipation of pushback from the opposition on this. And the idea is sort of out there that this might be difficult to get through. And in fact, there might even need to be a new election in order to force this legislation through. Now, you can sort of see why the opposition, many of whom will be facing losing seats, might not be in favour of this. And even within the LDP and Ishin themselves, you can imagine why some politicians might not want this, and some within both parties might be unhappy at the prospect of shrinking the size of both parties. In addition to that, the coalition between Ishin and LDP is a minority government because they have around 231 seats. Of the 233, they need to have an absolute majority. So even if there was no wavering whatsoever within their parties, it would still be very tight to get this legislation through. Assuming that the opposition wouldn't come around and couldn't be convinced of the merits of it. So I guess the question leading on from that is, why do Ishin want this so badly? So much so that they're willing to, invest so much political capital in this, join the LDP and coalition government and make it their very top demand and something they're willing to sort of potentially end the coalition over if they don't get this. Why is it so important to them? Well, I think there are a few possible motivations. One is that Ishin want to present themselves as sort of political reformers and people who are going to sort of clean up and improve the existing political system, and this bill reducing the size of Japan's parliament is one way to do it. And sort of the way to sell that is obvious because it means they're cutting costs for the taxpayer by having fewer members of the Diet drawing salary from the average taxpayer. And it's sort of arguably sort of less waste, less money going towards politicians and coming away from, sort of productive taxpayers. It also allows them to paint themselves as sort of being fiscally responsible, fiscally conservative by shrinking the size of the government and, the efficiencies starting at home and cutting from themselves, the political class and Japan's parliament first, in order to lower the cost of government in Japan and sort of pushing, efficiency and responsibility that way. It also seems sort of self-sacrificing, to sort of spend political capital on ultimately something that's arguably going to benefit the taxpayers and hurt the political class because you're actively shrinking it, and you're giving money back to the taxpayers, taking it away from the political class, and you're shrinking the political establishment, including shrinking the size of your own party. So it arguably paints Ishin as very responsible and self-sacrificing and sort of a noble thing to do in shrinking their own party and the political class within Japan. And it's also sort of good optics for them for having finally Ishin to have joined the government, joined a coalition, and taken a political risk doing so. And their very first action, highest priority, is to save taxpayers' money and to take money away from the political class. That's a very good sort of image to make and sort of a principled stance if you can sell it that way. And so arguably to be seen as sort of reformers in this way is one possible motivation why Ishin are doing this. Another argument is that they could argue for process reasons. It's more efficient to have less members of the Diet. There's less people, less views. It's more efficient to get people around to negotiate, to have votes. And it's sort of, maybe you could argue, if there's 10% fewer Diet members, you're sort of streamlining the process, making it more efficient, and it's sort of better to get things done, get things through Parliament, and get working for the people of Japan is something you could argue if there's like fewer voices and just a more streamlined, narrow focus. Now, the obvious counter argument to this is that there's going to be less diversity of views, less expertise, less sort of institutional knowledge if you're shrinking the amount of people and the amount of years of service in Japan's Parliament. As a result, fewer people, fewer ideas, fewer discourse, that sort of thing. You could make that argument as a counter to that. Another argument you could make is that if there's 10% fewer representatives, that means you're sort of meaning there are less local representatives. Each individual member of Japan's Diet has to represent more people, so there's less of a direct connection, arguably, between an elected member of the Diet and their representatives. They have less focus, less local knowledge, and it's harder for a constituent to know who their representative is and to have direct access to them and to speak to them and make their concerns known, as opposed to if you have more representatives with sort of a more of a focus brief, more of a regional focus, and sort of fewer people who you represent. It's more easier to know who your representative and have that direct contact with them, and as well as for them to know you and know your area. Aside from those possible motivations, there's arguably a bit of a political calculus, sort of a political motivation that Ishin might have in mind. Now, I'm not saying that this is Ishin's motivation, it's just a possibility. I don't think they would ever say this out loud publicly, I would imagine, but these are some sort of possible consequences of them putting this through, just as a matter of pure speculation. Now, it's yet to be determined exactly how this structuring and reducing of the size of Parliament by 10% would work, but depending on how it works, it's very, very possible that a measure like this, where you have less members of Japan's Diet, benefits larger parties, potentially including Ishin, and it hurts smaller parties and new entrants and new parties seeking to enter Japanese politics. This is because Japan has two distinct ways of voting. One is a district vote, where you vote for a politician in your local area, and whoever gets the most votes in a sort of a local mapped area, they win the seat, and that's it. Just one vote in one area. Sort of how the UK works in entirety, basically. First past the post system. Now, the other system Japan has is sort of a regional proportional vote, where there are various regions of Japan, and in each of those regions there's a second vote taken, and the seats in that region are assigned based on the total percentage of the vote given out, and you'll sort of go down the percentage and hand them out to each parties based on the percentage vote in total they got. Now, there's a strong likelihood, if this reform goes through, to reduce seats by 10%. That means that in each of these sort of regional proportional representation votes, there's going to be less seats to go around. And that will tend to, I believe, based on how this is implemented, but it's quite possible it will benefit the larger parties. So this will be parties potentially like Ishin getting 10 or so percent. They'll be among potentially the haves, as one of the larger parties, and also parties potentially like the DPFP, the Constitution Party, and certainly the LDP. So if parties getting 10 or 20, 30% or so, they'll be getting less seats overall, but they'll be getting a bigger slice of a reduced pie of seats. So even though the amount of seats is going down, parties with larger percentage votes are more likely to hold on to a bigger share percentage, whereas parties who are sort of smaller, parties like, for example, Reiwa, the Communist Party of Japan, new entrants like Sanzeto, the Conservative Party of Japan, parties who are sort of new entrants who are coming in and sort of getting 2, 3, 4, 5%, or parties that are maybe more historic but have shrinked, getting these, like I say, like small percentages of 2, 3%. If you cut the amount of seats, it's those who are more likely to lose out and not meet the threshold and be cut off, and get fewer seats overall as a result of this. And it'll be that much more harder for a new party entering Japanese politics and hoping to win through proportional voting. They'll have a sort of a higher threshold. They might have to go from, say, 2% to 3 or 4% if they want to get a seat in, and it's going to be that much harder for them to make that breakthrough, become an established party, and convince people to vote for them as a result. So arguably it sort of rewards established parties a little bit of an advantage as well. So arguably there's a bit of a possible benefit for Ishin and all sort of more established larger parties in Japan's overall proportional votes. to put a system like this through, and they might benefit from the long run. Even if there are fewer seats, they'll have a larger share of those seats that are remaining, and they're less likely to lose out in the long run. And there's also another factor to this potentially, which is that Ishin have a very, very strong regional base in Osaka. Now, the leader of Ishin is also the governor of Osaka, and they have a very strong representation there. They win a lot of their vote base there. Many of the representatives they have in Parliament come from Osaka districts, where Ishin tends to do quite well, and they have a bit of a regional stronghold there. So if there's fewer seats to go around, parties like Ishin, who have sort of a really good command on one particular area, could do slightly better and sort of be more likely to hold on to those strongholds potentially as a result of this. This is because, for example, if there's fewer seats to go around in a particular region, that means there's less sort of resource allocation, because if there's less districts in Osaka, for example, that means there's fewer areas where Ishin can have to compete, and they can sort of focus their resources more narrowly on a fewer districts and hope to win all of them, rather than having to spread their campaign across all of Osaka in that way. And there's also possibility, depending on how sort of the seats are cut and how things are redistricted, that they could sort of consolidate support overall Ishin, depending on how these districts are moving around as well. And so arguably, by reducing the amount of seats and the amount of areas where Ishin will have to compete, there's a possibility that they could sort of lock in sort of a local advantage in Osaka and make that a real stronghold and make it easier for them to hold on to, and make it harder for newer parties to break through in that sort of regional stronghold areas and unseat Ishin. Now, as I say, this is just speculation as to some of the possible reasons or benefits that Ishin might get from putting through a measure like this. This is not to say why they're necessarily doing it, but it's just interesting to think about and speculate on.